Venice. Today, tourists walk through flooded squares, ride gondolas past crumbling palaces, and take photos of architecture that seems frozen in a past nobody fully remembers. What they don't know is that beneath their feet lies the foundation of the entire modern financial system. Before New York, before London, before Amsterdam, there was Venice, a city that controlled Europe's money for over 500 years, created instruments that still shape banking today, and built an empire not through military conquest, but through ledgers, contracts, and an obsessive understanding of credit. This is the story of how a cluster of islands in a swamp became the most sophisticated financial machine the medieval world had ever seen. To understand how Venice became a financial superpower, you have to imagine Europe in the year 1000. The continent is fragmented, violent, and desperately poor compared to the civilizations of the East. The Byzantine Empire still controls Constantinople, the gateway between Europe and Asia. The Islamic world stretches from Spain to Persia, wealthy beyond European comprehension. And sandwiched between these giants is Venice, barely more than a collection of fishing villages built on wooden pilings driven into mudflats. They have no farmland, no natural resources, nothing but salt marshes, and an impossible geographic position. But that position was everything. Venice sat at the northwestern corner of the Adriatic Sea, perfectly positioned as a bridge between the wealthy East and resource-starved Europe. While other Italian cities fought territorial wars and built castles, Venice did something different. They built ships, hundreds of them. By the early 12th century, the Venetian arsenal, a state-run shipyard, could produce a complete galley in a single day using proto-assembly line techniques that wouldn't be replicated until the Industrial Revolution. This wasn't just shipbuilding. It was the systematic industrialization of maritime power. And they used that power not to conquer land, but to dominate trade routes. In 1082, Venice signed a Golden Bull agreement with the Byzantine Empire, securing extraordinary trading privileges throughout Byzantine territories. Venetian merchants paid almost no customs duties while competitors were taxed heavily. It was one of the first massive trade agreements in history, and it gave Venice a crushing competitive advantage. Within decades, Venetian galleys controlled the Mediterranean's most profitable routes. Spices from the East, grain from Egypt, slaves from the Black Sea, silk from Byzantium, and perhaps most valuable of all, the network of information that flowed with those goods. By 1200, Venice was already wealthy. But wealth alone doesn't create financial supremacy. What transformed Venice from rich merchants into financial architects was a crisis. In 1171, the Byzantine Emperor Manuel Komnenos, resentful of Venetian dominance, suddenly arrested thousands of Venetian merchants throughout his empire and seized their assets. It was a devastating blow. Venetian trade ground to a halt. Fortunes evaporated overnight. The Republic faced potential bankruptcy. But the Venetian response to this crisis would reshape European finance forever. Instead of raising taxes or debasing currency, Venice did something radical. They borrowed from their own citizens. In 1167, and repeatedly afterward, the Venetian state issued government bonds called prestatine. Citizens were required to lend money to the state, receiving in return bonds that paid annual interest and could be bought and sold on a secondary market. This wasn't charity. It was the birth of the modern bond market. What made the Venetian system revolutionary was its sophistication. The bonds were tradable, creating a secondary market where merchants could sell their government debt for cash. Interest rates fluctuated based on the state's creditworthiness. During military victories, bond prices rose. During defeats, they fell. By the 1260s, Venice had created a formalized exchange where these bonds were traded daily, with prices posted publicly. It was a stock market before stocks existed. The Rialto Bridge became the financial center of Europe, where traders gathered not to buy goods, but to trade debt, currency, and risk itself. And Venice needed this system because their ambitions were staggering. In 1204, Venice orchestrated one of the most audacious financial maneuvers in history. The Fourth Crusade needed ships to transport 33,500 soldiers to Egypt. Venice agreed to provide the fleet, but when the Crusaders couldn't pay the massive sum owed, Venice didn't cancel the contract. Instead, they renegotiated. The Crusaders would pay their debt by conquering Zara, a rival trading city, and then Constantinople itself. The result was the sack of Constantinople, the richest city in Christendom. Venice claimed 1/4 of the Byzantine Empire as payment. The financial windfall was beyond calculation. Venice acquired 3/8 of Constantinople, naval bases throughout the Aegean, control of critical trade routes, and access to the wealth of the East on unprecedented terms. More importantly, they established trading colonies across the Mediterranean and Black Sea, creating a commercial empire that generated enormous wealth for centuries. By the mid-13th century, Venice was the undisputed financial center of Europe. If you wanted to move large sums of money, borrow for a military campaign, or finance international trade, you went to Venice. What few people understand is how Venetian banking actually worked. It wasn't like modern banking. Venetian merchant families developed sophisticated systems for managing risk, credit, and international payments that were centuries ahead of their time. They used bills of exchange, a financial instrument that allowed merchants to transfer money across vast distances without physically moving gold or silver. A merchant in Venice could write a bill to a partner in Alexandria who would pay the local trader in Egyptian currency. Months later, accounts would be settled, exchange rates calculated, and profits distributed. It was an early form of international banking that made Venice indispensable to trade across 3 continents. Venetian bankers also pioneered double-entry bookkeeping, a system where every transaction was recorded twice as both a credit and a debit. This seems simple, but it revolutionized accounting. For the first time, merchants could track complex operations across multiple ventures, calculate profits accurately, and detect fraud systematically. The Venetian method spread throughout Italy and eventually became the foundation of modern accounting. When we talk about balance sheets, assets, and liabilities today, we're using concepts refined in medieval Venice. But the real genius of the Venetian system was how it aligned private wealth with state power. Unlike other medieval states where nobles hoarded wealth in castles and fought amongst themselves, Venice created a structure where the richest merchants were also the government. The Doge, Venice's elected leader, was chosen from among the merchant elite. The Great Council, which held ultimate power, was composed entirely of wealthy trading families. There was no separation between commercial interest and state interest. When Venice went to war, it wasn't for glory or religion. It was for markets, trade routes, and profit. Every naval campaign was essentially a business venture funded by bonds, executed by merchant families, and designed to generate returns. This system produced extraordinary wealth. By 1300, Venice had a population of around 100,000 but controlled trade flows worth multiples of what far larger kingdoms could generate. Venetian merchant families, like the Contarini, Mocenigo, and Dandolo, built palaces along the Grand Canal that showcased wealth beyond what most European nobles could imagine. But this wealth was always reinvested into the system. Venetians didn't build massive cathedrals or sprawling estates in the countryside. They built warehouses, expanded the arsenal, commissioned faster ships, and funded commercial expeditions. Everything was calculated for return on investment, and for nearly 3 centuries the system worked flawlessly. Venice fought and won wars against Genoa, its primary rival, in a series of conflicts that were essentially contests for commercial dominance. The War of Chioggia from 1378 to 1381 nearly destroyed Venice when Genoese forces blockaded the lagoon itself. But Venice, drawing on its bond market and the loyalty of its merchant class, raised an enormous fleet, broke the blockade, and destroyed Genoa's navy so thoroughly that Genoa never recovered its position as a Mediterranean superpower. Venice's financial system had quite literally saved the Republic. By 1450, Venice was at its absolute peak. The Republic controlled trade routes from the Black Sea to the Atlantic, operated colonies in Cyprus, Crete, and throughout the Aegean, and had established fondaci, Venetian trading posts with extraterritorial legal status, in cities from London to Alexandria. Venetian ducats, gold coins of exceptional purity, were accepted as currency throughout the known world. The Venetian arsenal employed over 16,000 workers and could assemble a war galley in hours using standardized parts and systematic production methods. No other state in Europe had this combination of financial sophistication, industrial capacity, and commercial reach. But beneath the surface, the system that had created this dominance was beginning to fracture. And the cracks appeared not through military defeat, but through a shift in the very structure of global trade. In 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Empire. Venice initially maintained good relations with the Ottomans, but over time, Ottoman expansion began closing off the eastern routes that Venice had dominated for centuries. The Black Sea trade, which had been a Venetian monopoly, came under Ottoman control. Access to spice routes from India became more expensive and politically complicated. Then, in 1498, everything changed. Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached India by sea. For the first time, European ships could sail directly to the source of spices, silk, and other eastern goods without passing through Mediterranean middlemen. The Portuguese, and later the Dutch and English, began establishing their own trade routes to Asia. Venice's geographic advantage, the very foundation of its wealth, had been rendered obsolete by a new maritime technology and a new route that bypassed the Mediterranean entirely. The Venetian response was to double down on what they knew. They fought a series of wars with the Ottoman Empire, trying to maintain access to their traditional markets. From 1463 to 1479, Venice and the Ottomans fought a brutal conflict that drained the Venetian treasury. Venice lost key colonies and was forced to pay tribute for trading rights that it had once controlled outright. The war cost 2 million ducats, an astronomical sum that required massive bond issues and began to strain the financial system. But what truly broke Venice wasn't military defeat. It was the slow, grinding reality of economic irrelevance. As Atlantic trade routes expanded, the center of European commerce shifted from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic coast. Antwerp, Amsterdam, and eventually London became the new financial capitals. They adopted Venetian techniques, bills of exchange, bond markets, insurance contracts, but applied them to a larger and more dynamic trading network. Venice found itself in a vicious cycle. Declining trade meant less revenue. Less revenue meant higher taxes and interest rates on government bonds. Higher costs made Venetian trade less competitive, which further reduced revenue. And here's where the Venetian system revealed a fatal flaw. The very structure that had made Venice powerful, the fusion of merchant wealth and state power, became a trap. The great merchant families who controlled the government were also the ones most heavily invested in government bonds. As the state sank deeper into debt, the nobles who governed Venice were financially incapable of making the radical changes that might have saved the Republic. Any default on government bonds would have bankrupted the ruling class. Any devaluation of the currency would have destroyed their wealth. So instead, Venice continued borrowing, hoping that somehow the old system would revive. By 1600, Venice was still wealthy by European standards, but it was no longer a financial superpower. The city that had invented government bonds now had a debt-to-revenue ratio that made borrowing impossibly expensive. The arsenal, once the technological marvel of Europe, was producing ships using methods that were now outdated. Venetian merchants, constrained by high costs and declining markets, increasingly invested their capital in land rather than trade, becoming a class of conservative landlords rather than dynamic merchants. And yet, Venice didn't collapse suddenly. It faded. For another 2 centuries, the Republic continued, maintaining its independence, its institutions, and the outward appearance of wealth. The palaces were still grand, the ceremonies still elaborate, the government still functioned. But the financial innovation that had defined Venice was gone. The last great Venetian contribution to finance came not from new ideas, but from the systematization of old ones. In 1587, Venice established the Banco della Piazza di Rialto, one of the first public banks in Europe, designed to prevent the failures of private banking houses. It was a defensive institution, not an innovative one. By 1797, when Napoleon's army arrived, the Venetian Republic surrendered without a fight. The Great Council, which had governed Venice for over 1,000 years, voted itself out of existence. The Doge abdicated. The republic that had defied emperors and popes, survived wars and plagues, and controlled the wealth of Europe for 5 centuries, ended not with a battle, but with a vote. Napoleon looted the city systematically, shipping Venetian art, manuscripts, and treasures back to Paris. The Venetian state was partitioned, its territories divided between France and Austria. What remained was a ghost. Modern tourists see Venice as a beautiful anachronism, a city preserved in amber. But what they're really seeing is the corpse of the world's first modern financial system. The Rialto Bridge still stands, but there's no bond market beneath it. The Doge's palace still overlooks the lagoon, but there's no merchant republic governing from within it. The Grand Canal still flows past magnificent palaces, but they're hotels and museums now, not the headquarters of trading dynasties. And yet, Venice's legacy is everywhere. When you check your bank account balance, you're using double-entry bookkeeping refined in Venetian counting houses. When governments issue bonds to fund deficits, they're using a system invented in medieval Venice. When traders buy and sell securities on secondary markets, they're operating in institutions that Venice created. The modern financial system, from New York to London to Tokyo, is built on a Venetian foundation. But Venice's collapse also holds a warning. A financial system, no matter how sophisticated, cannot survive the obsolescence of the economic structure it was built to serve. Venice created brilliant instruments for managing Mediterranean trade. But when that trade became irrelevant, the instruments couldn't save the system. The same merchant families who had built the Republic became its gravediggers, unable to reform because reform would have required them to sacrifice their own wealth. Nearly 1,000 years after Venetian merchants first set out from the lagoon, the pattern continues. Financial centers rise by creating systems that efficiently manage the dominant economic flows of their era. They fall when those flows shift and the institutions built to manage the old system become obstacles to adapting to the new one. Byzantium didn't collapse because it ran out of gold. Venice didn't fail because it ran out of merchants. Both fell because the world changed and they could not. Today, Venice stands as the most beautiful economic ruin in the world. The buildings remain, testaments to wealth beyond imagination. The canals still flow with the same tides, but the financial empire that made it all possible is gone, replaced by a tourism industry that profits from the memory of greatness without understanding what made that greatness possible in the first place. And if you look closely at the foundations of modern finance, at the bond markets and central banks and international payment systems that govern our world, you can still see the blueprint drawn by Venetian merchants in a flooded city 1,000 years ago. Now tell me, did you know about Venice's role in creating modern finance? Leave your opinion in the comments and suggest what financial empire or economic system you'd like to see uncovered next. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel to support our work diving into the stories that shaped how money moves through our world.